Okay, hello everyone, and welcome. And this is Alessio Sonitis. I'm the director of the Minitracker project, and today we have the last online event of the season of the 2023-24 academic season, which, from our perspective, has been extremely successful because we had a very successful exhibition at Palazzo Pitti and the Jewish Ghetto. We brought to completion a very, very difficult but challenging NEH grant on the Avvisi, literally digitizing the entire Avvisi in the Medici archive. And also we had a extremely successful, I think, online series thanks to Negar Rokar, who's been hosting every Tuesday at 11 in Italy and at 5 in the afternoon in New York, a series of lectures, both from sort of expert scholars, but also very young emerging scholars on any aspect of the Renaissance. And I think this is one of the things we're very proud of, the fact that we, as usual at MAP, try to bring together sort of senior scholars and younger scholars. And this is something that we continue doing even today. Today, we just left our offices we did a conference, we did the last lecture on Vasari, and of a long lecture on-site series on Vasari. And again, it was wonderful to see sort of, young scholars approaching Vasari, who's never really the hippest thing, always hip now, but and to see them sort of come together with sort of more senior scholars. Today's workshop discussion, I hope, is part of the last of a tripartite sort of series of workshops. The first one, and Marcello Simonetta, you can see right now, we'll discuss more at length in a second, was about, what is the new cheap paper of the 21st century. Mind you that this is part of the Arte del Negozio program, which is run by Arthur Klotz, who is a board member, and by Marcello Simonetta, who tries to bring, in many ways, themes from technology and themes from sort of humanist studies together in many ways. And one way was exactly to address, back almost a year ago, the aspect, what is the new cheap paper? What is the new medium, that was so instrumental in the 16th century, especially, to disseminate knowledge, namely cheap paper. What is that version? That sort of, how would we consider this cheap paper today? What is the element, the medium, whatever? And that was a very fruitful discussion. And then we also had another discussion on a more Machiavellian and at the same time modern theme, the relationship between skill and fortune, skill and luck, which also brought lots of people together from various different disciplines. Today, we're not having much of the sort of the modern component. In fact, we have three scholars, and in a second, I'll join Ada Palmer, who I see online, but just give me a second. When I finish speaking, I'll have you join in. Three scholars, three eminent, very well-known scholars, two are historians and one historian, on the Renaissance and the early modern period, discussing the myth, the idea, or the reality of genius, of the genius, which is something which we have been sort of dealing with here at the Minitracker project, because our genius in many ways is Cosimo the First, but it's not really the genius to many, if you know what I mean. So of course, I will introduce you briefly, and then I'll try to connect Ada, which is online, but not in the speaker sort of format. Randomly, the first one came online, of course, is Elizabeth Pilliod, who's a frequent guest at the Minitracker project, both online and in situ, and she is in Princeton, I guess. Yes, she is. She just said, and she is the author of a very recent book on Pontormo et San Lorenzo, which was published in 2022. We presented the book at MAP, published by Harvey Miller Brepols. And she is, of course, visiting professor at Rutgers University. Ada Palmer, which I'll try to get in somehow with my limited technology, is associate professor of early modern European history at the University of Chicago. And she is, of course, the author of kind of a very key work, at least for me, which is Reading Lucretius in the Renaissance, which was published maybe 10 years ago, more or less. But she's also equally known as a fiction writer in the famous, well-known Terra Ignota series. I think 4 novels have been published, I'm not sure. Finally, John Spike, who we see next to Marcello, our historian, curator, friend, really needs no introduction, who has published a myriad of articles and books during his career. But the one that's closest to me, dearest to me, is Young Michelangelo, a book that, you know, when he was writing it, we had a chance to discuss in the sort of in the brainstorm. I mean, you know, and it was wonderful to see the creation of this book live. So here I introduced everybody, and I will now leave the microphone to Marcello, who will give a brief introduction, more general, thorough introduction, actually. And then we'll start off with a very simple question, you know, which is, and I'll just give you sort of a preview, you know, what is a genius, you know? I mean, and we like to hear genius all the time. We hear genius all the time. I heard genius today 1,000 times. And now we're dealing with, you know, with the construction of a genius that is, you know, what we think is a genius, or what was created as a genius, probably around like everything horrible that happens in this world in the 19th century, right? And I leave it to Marcello. Marcello, a te.
Thank you very much, Alessio, and welcome everybody from MAP headquarters and from the Arte del Negozio. This program, funded by Arthur Clues, is a novel program at MAP, and it tries to bridge knowledge, initiative, enthusiasm coming all the way back from the Renaissance into not just the present, but the future of technology. So we are scuttling back and forth with our minds. And since the first workshop, Alessio evoked it before, and I will just say that it turned to be a very heated and almost dramatic debate about the impact of AI, a very shifty target, and something that is hard to sort of define because it keeps sort of changing over in perception and in our own sort of private and public lives. The second of our roundtables debates, as Alessio reminded us, was around the eternal theme, really the theme of human destiny, but seen through the lenses of the Machiavellian question, whether fortune or virtue rules that very destiny. I won't try to recap all the very sort of provocative thoughts that we went over in those 2 workshops, because they somehow prepare us for tonight's debate. And I'll try to give a very short sort of contextualized reflection upon the theme. I'm sure we will touch upon the fact that the concept of genius was absent in the Renaissance itself. It was not something that was part of a self-fashioning or self-perception, but it was a creation mostly of the 19th century. I would like to, at the very least, remind us of the writing of Jakob Burckhardt, the great historian, whose book called The Civilization of the Renaissance revolved very much around the concept of the exceptional individual. And he probably, among others, was responsible for a canonization of this concept, and the expression Renaissance man that is still used today is possibly born from his page on Leon Battista Alberti first, the first sort of universal genius, the well-rounded know-it-all who can basically do everything from riding horses to painting to writing treatises of architecture and sociology and satire and so on and so forth. Among those people who sort of helped shape this concept in the Renaissance itself, I like just to recall another name, the name of Baldassare Castiglione, author of a 2-century bestseller in Europe, the book of the courtier being not just the man who serves a prince within a court, but a man who whose education embraces every aspect of human understanding. And of course, that doesn't yet touch what will be the core of tonight's debate, which is about the artist becoming something beyond than somebody who's simply able to perform well on canvas or painting or frescoing. So simply throwing these subjects on the table, because I know that first John and then Elizabeth, then Ada have plenty to say about this, and Alessio and I are very eager to interact with them. So I will not sort of prolong for now my thoughts, and I will let first I think John speak, and then we'll go over around the table, the virtual table. Thank you.
Well, I'm looking at Alessio.
Yes, but they are looking at you.
He's making faces.
Okay, I can take him off if you want.
No, I like that. Our task tonight, I believe, is to expound on the unknowable. Lucky us. For example, to cite one of the topics that was written up in the very good précis, what the situation is. Appreciated that. I agreed with it entirely. To what extent, you wrote, was the, quote, Renaissance genius a product of his environment? And what I'm going to be doing is talking about the foundations of the culture that Burckhardt makes and transforms into what our feelings are today, how we generally think today. I'm going to talk today about what Vasari and Michelangelo thought was the meaning of ingegno, in other words, genius. Now, to what extent was the Renaissance genius a product of his own environment? The Florentines were already wondering about this at the peak of their Renaissance. In Vasari's biography of Perugino, who was admired, but no one ever called Perugino a genius. In fact, Michelangelo openly mocked Perugino for his endless repetitions of faces and poses. Vasari wrote proudly that it was only in Florence that artists became perfect in all the arts. Now, there's an unprejudiced conclusion, especially painting. And Vasari gave 3 reasons, the first of which was the criticisms that Tuscans freely dumped on each other, not tolerating from each other any form of mediocrity. And the Italian for that, because that's the only way I can show that they're talking about what we're talking about, uses the word ingegno, li ingegni liberi di natura, which means their minds were free to think critically of each other. Summing up, Vasari said, what was the answer? Why was Florence the nest for all of this perfection of the arts? And he offered solutions I think we should all, tattoo on our hands so as not to forget. It was the air of Tuscany. The Tuscan air goaded them to put ingegno first. Ingenio is our subject tonight, genius. Vasari's super influential Lives of the Artists is an excellent source to know Michelangelo's understanding of genius, ingenio. Since Michelangelo knew Vasari, he knew the first edition of Vasari's Lives, Vitae, and Vasari's undisguised theme in his biographies is that the greatest genius in art history was Michelangelo, whose ingenio, by my count, he describes about 75 times. Here's an example of how he does it in the Vitae. While discussing the awarding to Michelangelo of the commission to design and build the tomb of Pope Julius, Vasari makes it clear that Michelangelo had an inescapable superiority over his distinguished competitors, Bramante and Giuliano da San Gallo. And quote, finally, the work was given to him. The commission came to him as he was a person of more judgment, better intelligence, and greater invention. In the original, we can understand what he's talking about. More judgment, he says, is più giudizio. Better intelligence, migliore ingegno. And greater invention, maggiore invenzione. Now, then we have to translate them more because invenzione means original. And here we have intelligence as a common, acceptable to us translation of ingenio. But in fact, we can never be sure what they mean by ingenio because they use ingenio for so many different meanings. And this has been a source of tremendous confusion, and it may, come as consoling to know we shall never escape that confusion. It cannot be helped. The Italian language is extremely short on synonyms. Words like piano have at least 7 distinct meanings, and ingenio, I'm going to show you, 6 or 7 of maybe the 8 different possibilities it means. But what he did in order to try and tell you what he was thinking, and this will be interesting for people who care about how the sources are to be understood, he lined up these 3 things. All of them are qualities of ingenio itself. Judizio, judgment, means, of course, having the knowledge to make good decisions. And ingenio means something about understanding things and responding quickly. And invenzione, I already said, was originality. Further along in his book, Vasari begins to sprinkle the word epithet, divino, in his descriptions of Michelangelo's life. When Alessio and I were talking about this roundtable, he said he was interested in the divino aspect of it. Well, they're intimately linked, in fact, because it turns out that throughout his book, The Lives, Vasari finds every chance to stick in divino in the same word as ingenio. If you want to know how I spent my last 2 weeks, it's not gleeful reading, mind you, but it is interesting to see how he made this campaign, Vasari, that was realized at 1564 at the opening of the tomb, or closing the funeral at the tomb in Santa Croce, excuse me, for Michelangelo. What did we have there? But the title of the event was the entombment of the divine Michelangelo. And they printed a program, and it was distributed to everyone. And every good historic library has one. And from that day on, Divino Michelangelo. It was absolutely planned, and it was pulled off. Later, as I was started to say, writing about the competition between Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci over their frescoes in the Palazzo Vecchio, two battle scenes, Vasari writes that Michelangelo showed everyone a drawing that he had seen, and in them you could see divine figures. And some said, yes, we see that you have drawn them. Others said, this is a divinity of art that no other genius could ever arrive at. Now, this is a very curious bending of the word genius, that there's a lesser shade of it, which he's just invented. And it's only from the context that we can suppose with any validity that he's referring to Leonardo da Vinci, who naturally was there and was naturally celebrated. But the interesting thing is the best praise that Leonardo ever received from Vasari's book was, he said, he had a rarissimo ingegno. I mean, that just, that does not climb to the stars, the way Divino does. Meanwhile, we've arrived at an unavoidable point now, because now I have to point out, I have to confess that I cannot promise that reading Vasari's tomes for his use of ingegno will help us decipher all the meanings the word has. When he lines up three in a row, we can sort of make a group and say, well, this must contain all of them. But most of them are only buonissimo. And what would buonissimo ingegno be with all these different applications? The phenomenon, we have a phenomenon in front of us here, of the impossibility of simple and single answers is a phenomenon that is characteristic of the late 16th century. And the most memorable declaration, in my opinion, of this inability to be precise on specific matters was said by Giordano Bruno shortly before his death at the stake, that poetry needs rules, but there are as many rules as there are poets. And such is the situation with writers of the word ingegno. And so after that sober introduction, I would like to explain a bit what we can know about Michelangelo's understanding of the impegno. Admittedly, we know that genius has had various names over time and in place. The only thing that's indubitable is that it exists and that it's important to the human psyche. Genius is a concept, however, not a noun. It is a concept, a full-fledged concept that can be traced back to prehistoric humanity. It is not a noun, it is an epithet. It is a concept that someone else has projected onto a person or a place. This is similar to something that Alessia has just said. As we know, not only persons, but there are the genius loci, the genius of the place, the spirit of the place. Eons before Plato tried to define what was a genius, and considering for 1,000 years after Plato, genius meant a spirit. So a spirit is an aspect of it. The Romans believed in spirits as inhabitants of places, and this belief still exists. Many of us will realize this all over the world. People still believe in genius loci. The only other artist who was ever called Divino was Raphael, which was not Vasari's idea. He doesn't write about him in that way at all, because his subject, his loyalty, his theme, his obsession is Michelangelo. Raphael died very young and was honored because his paintings of the Madonna presented an absolute superiority to everyone else's, including Michelangelo's, which I'm sure irked him. In short, in fact, as I said, Michelangelo once derided Raphael by saying, "That painter of Madonnas." He knew it was coming. He didn't realize it was going to bite him. In short, it is inevitable that the three speakers tonight will offer different interpretations, simply because different interpretations have been modified and adjusted in time and places countless times.
John, may I interject here? Because you have many interesting things to say, but we want this to be an interactive panel. So I believe that at this point, if Elizabeth or Ada want to begin to show this difference, in perception of this concept, as John has began to outline it. Elizabeth, would you like to say something about this?
I will give it a try. Okay. So I'm just thinking about this and thinking about how John has very studiously read through his Vasari, and my hat's off to you for doing all that homework. Thank you for doing that for us. I myself, being a bit more lazy, had not done that, but a couple of things. Obviously, the beginning of Michelangelo's life covers on his horoscope, on the date he was born and the position of the stars in the sky. And I want to add to what you said by saying that Vasari claims that because certain stars were in certain positions, that this special person has come into the world who it has been selected by none other than God above and sent down to help correct all the errors that have been made by everyone preceding him. And that this was written in the stars, the position of Mercury, so perfect communication, etc. Things like that, very specific. He actually is very specific about this. And I just wanted to point out that erecting horoscopes of world leaders, from Henry VIII to Cosimo I to the popes, all of this was becoming more and more common. And that the way Vasari wants to use this connects everything John has discussed, which is the use of the word genius, that it is a spirit, and I'm thinking, as you mentioned, of the genii in Roman art, which are essentially are the progenitors of Italian putti in paintings and sculptures. They're little spirits, and that's how they were envisioned. But of course, it's very important that they contain within them a drop or two of divine spirit from above. They're not just cute, right? So that idea, and that it is preordained so that you can't just get there by working hard and studying and practicing. You just can't. You can become diligent all you want, but you can't get there without having been chosen. So we could debate, I guess, and this is me being a bit snarky, whether or not the reason Vasari even does this is because you said he's obsessed with Michelangelo. He's really obsessed with Michelangelo. And Michelangelo does not, unfortunately, return that admiration. Michelangelo thinks Vasari is an idiot. That's a technical art history
Another
term.
sign of his wisdom.
That's a very technical art history term, idiot. Okay.
Yeah.
You have to look it up in the literature. Okay, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Actually, maybe, Elizabeth, we should come clean. Before we went on, Elizabeth said, "Is there any question I should say?" And I said, "Well, why don't you go into the horoscope and everything, because it's so important." And she's just done a magnificent job. 100% on point. And the conclusion is exactly as she says. The fact that this, whatever this thing is to be called, this spirit or this ingenio, we have a letter he writes his father to be sure he's got his planets in order. And then he says that he's a Pisces, and they have wonderful qualities. And in fact, as was said, it comes from heaven, that the genius part descends from heaven. They say that in lots of different ways. I saw a couple of ways. And so I just think it works. But we have to admit that, I knew you were going to ask me that.
Okay. Marcello.
You're joking, by the way.
Yes. So
No, let me say something.
Sure.
I want to, before I bring in Ada, because I'm actually, one thing I wanted to do, two things. One thing is this. I had a professor at Columbia, David Rosen, who said to me, don't underestimate Vasari. And I was young and I didn't know what I was doing. I liked the archives and I thought, Vasari, I don't know, come on, please. And I realized how right he was after many, many years. However, that said, this is the anniversary of Vasari's death. So here in Florence, and especially at MAP, we've been bombarded with tsunami on Vasari. So I'm hoping that Ada can actually take us out of Vasari for a split second and tell us a bit about what genius means outside this, just for a split second. We can go back in Vasari, because no matter what you do, it's like New York. You're always going to end up in New York, no matter what happens in your life, right? So Vasari is the same thing. So please, Ada, please take us a little bit, maybe to Poggio Bracciolini, if you can, or to that, in that world, please.
Yes. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, because I work primarily on, scholars and classicists and the umanisti. I was going to talk a little bit about the way they talk about the artists, especially since so many of them are eating at the same table and going on the same picnics. And then a little later, I want to jump further out and talk a little bit more about 19th century and modern ideas of genius, for which I have some ideas from primary sources. When I'm looking at writings about the artists and debates about the state of art in the Renaissance that are written by my classics scholars, one interesting pattern to look at, which ties into what was already brought up, is when they're using the word divino to describe some sort of excellence, because scholars use divino. Scholars who hang out with Raphael use it for Raphael, absolutely. Bembo and others who went on this famous picnic that they took Bembo and Castiglione to at Hadrian's villa, they use divino for Raphael. People start using divino for Michelangelo. The scholars use divino a lot for divinely inspired philosophical sages. They use divino for Pythagoras, and they use divino for Virgil, and they use divino for Plato. They use divino for the figures that, in Ficino's idea of there being a second divine revelation to the pagan philosophers parallel to the divine revelation to the Hebrew prophets, they use divino as this is a person whose output on earth reflects divine inspiration in a poetic, literary, or artistic direction that is intended to be a sort of a guiding light sent by heaven for humanity thereafter. And it's interesting to me to note how often the language that they use for the type of philosopher that they're also thinking of as almost a saint, a figure like Pythagoras, whose biographies in the Renaissance are very much constructed as if he's a quasi-saint, and he goes and founds these private philosophical communities, which are described as if they are monasteries, and his persecution is described as if it's a martyrdom. That there's a category of figure that they're thinking of as a divinely sent guide for humanity, which might be a philosopher or might be a saint, or might, in the case of Raphael and Michelangelo, be an artist, that falls into this very interesting category of divino, meaning divinely inspired and used as a tool of divine guidance for the rest of humanity, which is a neat use of language. The second pattern that I notice that they use occasionally when they're talking about only their very favorite artist friends or the artists that they're praising the most, that they also sometimes use for their favorite ancient figures, is the idea of surpassing nature. We all recognize this from Bembo's famous epitaph for Raphael, that while he lived, nature feared she would be conquered. But there's a lot of discussion among scholars as to whether humanity has the potential to do better than nature. Are we, while an artist is painting a flower, is that flower more perfect and more beautiful than any real flower? Or is the painting of a saint more perfect and more beautiful than any real human being? And similarly, they discuss whether a poet is achieving something more beautiful than anything nature can achieve, or whether a philosopher or a saint is achieving something that surpasses the imperfect and flawed, shadowy, platonic, imperfect world of matter and approaches something divine. So that another way that they are clearly conceiving a category we can think of as genius in a direction is whether somebody is able to ascend above the imperfect level of nature and produce something that is more beautiful, more wise, more divine, more excellent, more inspirational, and more didactic, more capable of teaching virtue, more inspirational than the objects that exist within nature. And this is then considered to be a sign of goodness or approaching heaven or of approaching God. And I would add those concepts to the ones Vasari deploys as being ones that scholars are applying to artists, but also to architects and also to philosophers and also sometimes to monarchs when they're writing a handbook of politics and they're talking about a really virtuous ruler like Alfonso the Magnanimous of Naples, who they will say approached a divine or surpassing nature state of kingship. And how that is constructed in the same way as what is categorically different about this person. They are achieving something that seems like it is beyond what the imperfect realm of matter could achieve. I'd love to pause there before turning to the question of modern constructions of genius, because I've just finished a new book that is a historiographic review of ideas of the Renaissance. And I'd love to jump into the question of how all this relates to Elon Musk's tweet in December that if we had a population of 1 trillion humans, then we'd have 1,000 Mozarts at any given time. And a lot of this stuff is a very modern question, a very Renaissance question. So before I jump into that, I want to pause to just invite the others to see if you have anything to add to the suggestion of Divino in this surpassing nature and or divinely inspired sage like Pythagoras, Virgil, or Plato direction.
I have a question. I wonder if your thinking that you just described make things even better than has ever been seen before. I mean, that would apply to the generation of William Blake. Are you interested in him?
Yeah, very much. And I'm also interested in the ways later when Shakespeare starts to get constructed as a genius, and England is making its own argument for the peak of the Renaissance being theater and a little later rather than art, and in Italy. These different efforts to construct an ascent and then a pinnacle. In particular, because one of the debates that humanisti are often engaged in is the question of, can we aspire to surpass the ancients, or can we merely aspire to try to be as good as or almost as good as the ancients? And so the question of a genius as surpassing often has two things that we're asking if they can surpass. Can they surpass nature, and can they surpass antiquity?
Well, I hope we never fall into such severe categorizing. Right? I mean, we surpass them, don't surpass them, fall short every day. The human condition is not quite that boxed up yet. So let us hope.
I would just add, I thought that was fascinating. Thank you. And I would just add that I think that artists were in a trickier position than writers, for instance, or philosophers, because the background for artists in antiquity was that they, despite big names, of artists in antiquity, they were considered part of the manual arts and mechanical arts, and therefore on a lower, they begin on a lower step, right?
Social stratum.
As opposed to, say, someone like a poet, which is, of course, much higher, let alone a
Intellectual
philosopher.
labor.
Yeah, music, right, exactly. And my people, of course, talk about my artists that way. Vincenzo Borghini, the prior of the Hospital of the Innocents, when he writes to Vasari at a certain point and chides him for including biographical details, saying, what interest do we have in the lives of artists? I mean, after all, they're not poets. Which is interesting. So it's a big
Oasis on the other end.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I'm just saying, and that comment is very interesting if you're interested. And again, I won't go back to Vasari too much more, but in the ways he treats certain artists, it's like the more he talks about their personal lives, the lower they are in terms of genius or special categories. I mean, pure Piero di Cosimo. Wow. I mean, he's just, burying eggs and eating them out of the backyard. Look, this is not a comment that's meant to highlight your ingenio. So.
Well, and on that, there's a sequence over the course of the Renaissance of different arts that were considered manual labor rather than intellectual labor and were therefore lower status, having people make a case for raising their status. And Vasari, as well as Leonbattista Alberti, are engaged with this for architecture and art. It's also what you see Bartolomeo Scapi doing later with cooking. And there's actually a lot of structural similarity between Scapi's writings and Vasari's in terms of trying to make a case to think of this as a high status occupation that is artistic and creative and intellectual labor rather than manual labor. As we see the effort by different generations to push different skills, musicians are also engaged in this. And the question of whether music is manual labor or intellectual labor is something that gets litigated in Florence and elsewhere. There was a good talk at RSA about it, this litigation of this in Florence versus Bologna working differently because the guild systems work differently. And so what guild a musician could be in working differently. And when we see things like Cellini's father pushing Cellini to be a musician instead of a goldsmith, how much that is about status, just like Michelangelo's family being ashamed at first at being merchant class to have a artist, which was a manual labor profession, son. So it's neat to see over and over for different arts, including music and then cooking, this effort to argue for the intellectual labor status of different art forms and constructing genius as existing for that art form, or divino status as existing for that art form, being intermixed with the question of defining it as an intellectual or soul dominated rather than body or appetites dominated function.
It was a difficult battle for them to win. A good example of how hard it was when they were going to give a major knighthood to Velázquez. His old friends from Seville, the Zurbarán and Zurbarán and Murillo, went and swore he had never painted to sell the works. It was only as a noble pastime that he had painted. And he got his knighthood.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, Marcello, you want to say something before we go to the next sections?
Yes, absolutely, because I think, we laid groundwork, so to speak. We went through the etymology, the use, and we're beginning to walk into the territory of abuse of the word and the concept. And I think that is obviously much more relevant to today's world. This debate we just had about the switch between the mechanical arts that were originally considered lower that through this revolution that's represented by what we call the Renaissance, all of a sudden are catapulted to the top, so to speak. And the ability of someone like Michelangelo, Raffaello, Leonardo to combine the intellectual power with the manual execution is something that is absolutely new and leads all the way to today's world. And I love very much the reference that Adam made to Bartolomeo Scapi. How often do we hear that the super chefs of today are, geniuses because they invented whatever, restaurant formula that people kill in order to go and eat. And also this, of course, inserts the element of selling, which has also been mentioned by John, with this kind of disdain, aristocratic disdain towards, selling product, selling your soul, your divine soul, and turning it into money. Now, I very much look forward to hearing what Ada has to say about that tweet, a famous or infamous tweet by Elon Musk. Elon Musk being, of course, someone who is both admired and reviled as a genius, quote unquote, as someone who in fact embodies the very idea of a Renaissance Superman inside the technological world we live in. And of course, this idea of genius today is related strongly with the idea of making tons of money. Now, is it true that if we had trillions on Earth, we would automatically have thousands of Mozarts? Well, this is the question I'd like to ask to all of our panelists, because I think it's relevant both to the very concept and the history that we've been tracing, but also to the present and the future of its use and abuse. So another round, I think, would be very lively now. Ada, you want to start since you brought that up, and then we'll.
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, my favorite response I saw anyone write to the Musk tweet directly, which I loved at the time, was to point out and remind us all that Mozart's sister, who had every bit as much skill as he did and co-performed with him when young, but then because she was a woman, people didn't want to continue supporting her, and she was married off and left us no legacy, demonstrates very clearly that we don't need more people to have more Mozarts. We need more supportive infrastructure around everybody, and that we already have innumerable people with enormous amounts of talent and skill who are just never getting to actually display and nurture it and leave a legacy because of not being supported. So I remember that essay ending with, if what you want is more brilliant musicians, what you need is UBI, so that people can go be a musician instead of being stuck working in a restaurant or at Kmart in order to make the bills pay, which is a really good argument. I've been looking in my book, Inventing the Renaissance, which is actually my first effort to write pop history rather than scholarly history, and it's an effort to do a pop history of the historiography of the Renaissance. So introducing people to the fact that the Renaissance is an invented concept, who came up with it, Bruni separating the Middle Ages from a presumed Renaissance, Burckhardt's construction of it, because popular history almost never includes historiography. And it's been very fun for me reviewing how we construct the Renaissance and trying to translate all of these historiographic things that we're used to discussing very academic terms into more publicly accessible ideas of, the Renaissance went something different during the Cold War from what it meant during World War II, from what it meant during the Roaring '20s, because people kept reimagining it in their local contexts. And in doing so, and in looking at, therefore, some of the superstar figures that are most famous today, especially Machiavelli and Michelangelo, one of the things I ended up focusing on is the degree to which a genius, for the way we talk about them now, is very much a historical figure whose biography has been edited and presented in such a way that we see the glorious produce, and the only negative or impediment sides of the biography that are left in are things that can seem like a heroic flaw. So to give an example, there's a letter, which is my favorite Renaissance document ever, which Machiavelli received in 1506, sent by Biagio Boncorsi, who was writing to Machiavelli from Florence while Machiavelli is out among the wars being an envoy, saying that they're trying desperately to send Machiavelli his salary because Machiavelli has been having trouble for years, ever since 1501, getting his actual salary while he's in the field being an ambassador, first with Cesare Borgia and then under Julius. And it means that he can't afford new shirts, and he's having to appear in front of heads of state and princes and dukes and the Pope in scruffy old shirts, which he thinks is embarrassing Florence and undermining its reputation as a fabric production capital. And so he's been desperately trying to get enough money to present himself presentably to reflect the Florentine city. And the letter says, okay, Machiavelli, we've given your salary to Michelangelo because he's on his way to where you are. And we think nobody will mug Michelangelo because they all know how much Pope Julius cares about Michelangelo. And everyone has heard the story of when they were in Bologna and a Monsignor of the church insulted Michelangelo and the Pope literally beat him with a staff. And so we hope that the bandits will just leave off Michelangelo because they'll be that scared of Julius picking on anybody who picks on Michelangelo. And so this is our solution to try to get you a new shirt. And then there's another letter a few weeks later saying, sorry, even Michelangelo gave up and turned back because the roads are that full of bandits and it's just too dangerous and we can't help you. You're going to have to get somebody to lend you a shirt again. And these kinds of details don't appear in the way any of these figures are presented in the modern day. Any reference to people having an embodied existence, having laundry, being cranky, the heart-wrenching moment when in Michelangelo's own reflective memoir, he talks about how the entire 2-year reign of Pope Adrian, he never picked up a chisel because he was so stressed out from the combination of a Pope hostile to artistic patronage and the lawsuits about the unfinished Julius tomb, that his stress overwhelmed and consumed him and he couldn't touch art for 2 years. I shared that anecdote with lots of people during 2020 and 2021. And so many people said, oh, wow, I feel so relieved because I too have been so stressed this year that I can't do my thing. And I felt like it meant I'm a failure. But if even a genius like Michelangelo went through that, then maybe I'm an okay person and maybe I can achieve something. And I think it's very important for us to remember how much the 19th century construction of genius left us with. A genius is this perfect person who has this amazing talent, and then they might have a heroic flaw, like Michelangelo's, temper is described as a heroic flaw in his biography. And you get lots of presentations of Michelangelo, whether in books or in what the tour guide says when they're standing people in front of the David, talking about his terrible temper. But they don't also talk about, times he was stressed out and in the middle of lawsuits and out of work, or the times that he, fled from Florence twice when it was about to be under siege and berated himself later for being a coward and abandoning his country at the moment that it needed him, but he was a coward. None of that makes it in there. Neither does the fact that Machiavelli ran out of clean shirts. Neither does the fact that Machiavelli used to wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares about the Swiss invading Italy. Neither does the details about Machiavelli having been a sexual assault survivor, which is something that never makes it into discussions of Machiavelli, even though so much ink has been spilled over his rape similes when he talks about taking fortune by force. And yet almost no one who's working on him is even aware that we have these wonderful documents from Vittoria about the sexual assault that they experienced. So how much we want to remember that in many ways, the definition of a genius today is that it is an artificially constructed person out of whose biography everything mundane, everyday, and boringly flawed has been removed, leaving only heroic flaws and genius produce. And that this construction, which is not only all over the Renaissance, but ways we talk about other people, is hugely responsible, I think, for the prevalence of imposter syndrome. Because when we look at narratives of history and we say who had the power to actually do something meaningful in history, it's always somebody who does not have any of the mundane problems that we do. And I'll leave with the interesting example. I've been looking recently at Shakespeare, and Shakespeare has 3 speeches about insomnia, and there's reams of literature speculating as to whether Shakespeare might have been insomniac or might have had melancholia, and comparing his melancholia with Ficino and other famous people who had melancholia, such as Rousseau. There are lots of letters where Shakespeare says, "I'm sorry I can't come to X event, I'm sick again." Lots of them. And there are lots of letters about pain, and there are poems about pain, and there are 4 poems about lameness and similes of being unable to walk. And there is no literature, no scholarly literature at all about Shakespeare and chronic illness, except people who say clearly Shakespeare was lying and making up the excuse of being sick so that he could stay home and write more because he was inspired to write. That we edit away the right in our faces, real human, mundane, ordinary, he was chronically ill, lots of people are chronically ill. And we only allow the heroic flaw, melancholia. So to have us think about how much the construction of a genius as an edited person, out of whose life we've removed mundanity, leaving only heroic genius and heroic flaw, is one of the things that defines the impact that the archetype of genius has on the modern day, and how hard it is for people to believe that they themselves are capable of changing the world, and how willing they are to believe that only a special and heroic figure like Elon Musk is capable of changing the world.
Thank you very much, Ada, for this. It was a wonderful tirade. And I am particularly grateful to you because you brought in another big M, Machiavelli, about whom I'd be tempted to jump in and take over in a sort of moment of will to power. But the question it really is on the table that you brought it up is we tend to confuse genius and hero. And that is not the case. And in fact, Machiavelli, as we all know, and you especially, of course, if he is a genius, he is considered by most an evil genius. And as you very nicely humanized him as a person, he was far from being evil, and certainly was very human, and he showed it in many ways. He was certainly less Machiavellian than most of his contemporaries. But what he did that was genius was to sort of speak out the truth, as he called it, the effectual truth of the thing, which is true for everyone, but almost no one wants to accept. So that is the sort of moment of genius that anybody could have reached using their brains, but nobody actually dared write down. So here, I like to have this contrast in this debate here, because otherwise we get sort of stuck within the, Vasari, Michelangelo sort of dialectic, which is endless, but ultimately it turns around in circles, and it doesn't really get us the sense of how potential and achievement are often at odds. And of course, I like to quote the silly, famous, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So is it true that genius cannot be taught? Of course it is, but it also isn't. How much discipline, how much devotion to an art, to a technique, to an ability that is honed for years has to do with the achievement of the genius versus its potential. So these are, of course, questions that relate to each of us in every possible way. And so I like to continue, of course, the conversation, but not sort of being caged within the sort of Renaissance genius, and I completely, utterly agree with you, there's no perfection that should be related to genius. Genius is an utterly imperfect being, and therefore is an outsized, out of bounds, out of the box, a creature that somehow achieves things that nobody else has achieved, but is part of the world where there are other potentially genius people who may have not been for the reasons that you started laying out. So let's see who else wants to jump in now.
Well, I have in front of me a letter that will intrigue Ara. When Michelangelo was neurotic, really. There was a ball of nerves, and he's very cowardly also. I mean, this is the fact. And you would enjoy my book, The Young Michelangelo, about which my publisher said because I only told it from looking over his shoulder what he knew. I didn't write, this person will be back. So it's the story of 20 people who were there that he was interacting with. And my publisher said when I turned it in 6 years late, he said, if anyone had told me that it was possible to create suspense as to whether Michelangelo would paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, I should have thought they were mad. But in fact, he had not finished many things going up there. And I write about them in just the same as the things that were realized. When he ducked out, he was afraid he was going to lose the competition with Leonardo da Vinci over their frescoes, because what he was doing with all these wonderful male nudes was, based on the Signorelli model that everyone was so impressed by. And he had no idea that Leonardo would come up and actually make figures that were in motion spinning around. And he realized he had lost this thing. And so he ran out on the competition and went to Rome. And then when he was in Rome, and they announced he's going to be doing the tomb of Julius, he got afraid through nothing concrete, but the Pope was thinking about battles with other realms, and so was not paying much attention to him, and so he just left and went back to Florence. And this was a terrible thing to do from the point of view of offending the Pope, and so they wrote 3 letters to the Gonfaloniere, Piero Soderini, saying, the Pope writes them and says, look, you have to send him back. I mean, I don't even know why he ran away. And the letter says, Michelangelo, the sculptor, who left us without reason and out of mere caprice, is, we understand, afraid of returning, though we, knowing the humors of such men of genius, have nothing against him. Still, in order that he may dismiss any suspicions, we rely on your loyalty, this to the Gonfaloniere Soderini of the Republic, we rely on your loyalty, that you will promise him in our name that if he returns, he shall be neither hurt nor injured, and we will restore him to the same apostolic favor which he enjoyed before he left us. He was, as Soderini put it at this time, he was terrified. So, these things are known about them, and we're talking about, I don't know if it's your point or my colleagues here, to what a point, I thought you overstated the case. They're not all mad, but he was certainly nervous.
while Elizabeth may think of more riposte, I just wanted to mention, since you mentioned a pop book about the Renaissance, which I look forward to reading, of course. I did my bit in this department, not just by writing books that are narrative nonfiction, but I was the consultant for a video game, blockbuster video game called Assassin's Creed, which is set between Florence in the 15th century and Rome in the early 16th century under the Borgias. And your anecdote about Machiavelli's clothing reminded me of several anecdotes while I was doing that job. And I consider it an important moment because, when I tell students that I wrote 15 books, they couldn't care less. But if they tell them I was the consultant for Assassin's Creed, believe me, they think I'm a genius. And I'm not. But the thing is, they had put Swiss guards in the Borgia period. And I strongly objected to that. You say that Machiavelli was having nightmares about the Swiss coming, of course, and kicking his butt, which they did, in fact. But at some point, actually in the very year you mentioned, 1506, it was Julius II, the Pope, who crushed effectively the Borgias, was the one who eventually hired the Swiss to become, for centuries to come, the papal guards. So it was utterly wrong of the video game to have Borgia guards being Swiss guards, and the game was going to be released. We're talking about billions of dollars invested here in publicity and so on. They were desperate, and so they turned them simply papal guards. But they didn't wear, luckily, the garments that Michelangelo himself drew for them, the very colorful uniform that we all know, which looks like Arlequin. So this is just a semi-joke, but is also meant to remind us that playing with fire, which means imagination crossing history, is actually a very useful tool to understand the Renaissance. And the main character of this game is a purely fictional character, like in Dumas' novels, but this character's name is Ezio Auditore. His mentors are, on the one hand, Leonardo, who is like Q in 007 movies. He just provides him with a cool kit of tools, including flying machines, of course, that work, unlike the reality. And also Machiavelli on the other side, who of course is political consultant and advisor, and sometimes is a bit dubious in morality, but very effective in action. So just to say that this kind of elements do a lot more than we can imagine to keep the interest alive for the Renaissance, and also to translate that for contemporary generations whose language is probably not the written word mostly, but it's the visual animation. And so I consider that a contribution, so to speak, to the cult of genius of the Renaissance in our times. And let's see now.
Yeah, and briefly on Assassin's Creed, I've been doing a bunch of video game consulting lately as well, but also analysis of the Assassin's Creed series. Because even before the Renaissance chapter, which you were brought in for, one of the things about that video game series is that the framing that connects the different games posits the existence of this scientific secret society that has existed since antiquity and is trying to sort of safeguard reason, which is actually an old concept in modern fiction. You see it in the 1970s film Legend of the Delta Knights, and ties into outdated now 19th century ideas of the Renaissance being enabled by secularization. The same sort of fantasy version of the Renaissance that the popularity impact of Greenblatt's The Swerve also tapped into, this idea of a radically secular Renaissance, which proliferates in popular imagination on a huge range of levels. And it's been really fun to compare the Assassin's Creed video game series and a Pulitzer-winning Pulitzer-winning book actually still echoing exactly the same outdated and distinct version of the Renaissance, but which appeals to the modern appetite for there to be a genius of the Renaissance and for that genius to be modernizing, quasi-secular, to be something that resembles us. This idea of these people being ahead of their time, and that if you could talk to people in 1450 and you talk to the geniuses, they would agree with us moderns more than if you talked to regular people. And I think that's an important part of our modern construction of Renaissance genius and genius in general, is the perception that somehow geniuses exist ahead of their time and are previews and enablers of the better values and ethics and worldview that the subsequent centuries will come to, and that the genius has the duty to then help create, which is one of the problems that creates these cult followings of figures like Elon Musk, who construct themselves as, just as the modern scientific revolution was enabled by Machiavelli secretly maintaining the ancient cult of reason throughout the superstitious Middle Ages, just so our techno-utopian future will be enabled by our present geniuses who anticipate what the future must be like him. And that is one of the things that cultivates the cult followings of modern self-styled geniuses, imagining that geniuses operate in reality the way they do in Legend of the Delta Knights and Assassin's Creed, where the details of the historicity were delightful, but the framing story advances these very interesting claims about history. And I will finish by saying that I'm currently at a conference at the think tank in the Santa Fe Institute, which is half physicists, half science fiction writers. And the thing that I'm here discussing with them is they always need examples of the fact that, in fact, history happened and certain things that they just came up with are actually several hundred years old. But also that one of the characteristics of how we imagine change over time and the ability to shape the future is that we tend to imagine the power to do that resting in very few people's hands, which is an old, Thomas Carlyle, heroes and hero worship way of thinking about history. So I'm here to argue to the other writers here that every author of science fiction, fantasy, or historical fiction is actually a historian, in that every author of works like this is making a claim about how history works and who has power and who changes it. So that everyone who sits down to write a Star Trek episode or a fantasy story, George R.R. Martin is making an argument about who has the power to change the fate of that world and who doesn't, which is a big part of what historians are doing, making arguments about how history changed. And thus that we have to understand that the historian's craft is being practiced by a much broader range of fiction than we imagine, not just historical fiction, but any fiction in which the world is at stake.
I want to say
I guess
something.
Can I speak to that,
Yeah.
Alessio? Very interesting on so many levels. And I think the idea that we're talking about, it hasn't been said yet, but you're of course outlining the silhouette of the romantic genius and the romantic construct of the genius, which was also extended, and this is apropos of what Ada is saying, to great leaders such as Napoleon. You see, he himself is more important as a changer of world history than he is for his being height challenged, let's say, i.e. short, and other things, and his illnesses, which were, he was not in good shape at all for a very long time. Let's say that. Same with Cosimo Primo, for that matter, if I want to talk about the Medici. He was in horrific health. So I want to drag us back a bit to history in the way that I like to do it, which is I like to auto-project myself into the past and think of and be there. And so the only way I can really be there is through documents and letters, and you've been mentioning these things. But for instance, the notion of the shirts, that he's very concerned that honor is embodied in the shirt, right? For those of, not for you all, but for others who might be listening in, this is, in fact, an important thing for us to understand about early modern times as opposed to our times. First of all, the discipline or art of psychology had not yet been invented. The exteriority of people and things were what they were. Your whole interiority that we worry about a great deal, and I think with good reason, as a matter of fact, was not delved into. The concept of psychology, the way we understand it, does not exist in the period, and certainly not even earlier. So that the wife and husband team of the Cohens have written the fantastic groundbreaking articles about how the facades of Roman houses are, in fact, the determinants of the honor of the people who live and work behind them. It's the same as the shirts. We need to understand that what we consider to be very superficial was really the membrane on the outside is what people saw and used to understand those around them. Then, being the kind of scholar I am, and by the way, I have never consulted on a video game, so just saying. What we're missing, for instance, is all of the other information. Why didn't everybody write a diary? And if you read, I've worked on this project a great deal. If you read about the history of diary writing, they are actually born, according to some writers and thinkers, out of the Protestant religion, because self-analysis and self-awareness became something that they, in contradistinction to the Roman Catholics, began to focus that each individual needs to look a bit at themselves and be in charge of that. And this, I think, is a very powerful concept. Then, in terms of what we know about people, we don't have the information, and particularly as regards women. Let's talk about the great fund of archival documents written by women. No, we can't, because they're not there. They're just not there. If they wrote them, they were destroyed. We have some poetesses, we have some writers. Yes, 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 fantastic. That's not the same. I'm talking about, what about the life of, for instance, Alessandro Allori's sister, who's married to a guy who makes swords and stuff like that. Or actually, I'm sorry, I'm in error. He actually works making clothes in the ducal court for various types at a very high level. Okay, they're artisans. She picks up his salary. She picks up her brother's, who is the court painter, the eminent court painter in the 1580s, for instance. What about her life? I mean, really, we don't have it. So I want to point out that we don't have it. Meanwhile, there are millions of sources that no one is actually looking at. I'm being very difficult. You see how difficult I can be? I'm giving you all a hard time. So, for instance, letters, and Marcello, of course, is going to immediately understand this. If you just sit down and read through all 653 pages of a filza of letters by almost, I can name millions of names, but any functionary who left letters, one of the things that comes up insane amounts of time is how observations about how somebody else's health is deteriorating and they're on death's door. It'll be a miracle if they last another night, another 2 days. They write letters telling Cosimo and Francesco Primo and Ferdinando The Pope, oh, and his face looked green, and he was I won't even go into the details. He was just losing fluids from every part, every orifice, and it'll be a miracle. They did this, this, and this. They bled him. They did everything possible. That material really, really, really is not as out there as it could be, which would illuminate, in a way, the interior lives and concerns of these people. And I'll come to a final point here. That's why when Rudolf and Margot Wittkover wrote Born Under Saturn, and it collected, just from published accounts, every little oddity about how artists, if Rosso Fiorentino had a pet monkey, you see, those bits of evidence were all they had, right? And all of us are digging up more evidence all the time. Then they drew the conclusion that artists were melancholics, neurotics. They were sometimes romantic heroes as well, but they're all essentially suffering from various levels of mental instability. That's a kind of historical view from front to back. Sorry about that, but I couldn't resist.
Yes, I want to tie everything up and bring the discussions slightly somewhere else. I mean, and it's partly connected actually with what you're saying, Elizabeth, which is this. I mean, we started this thinking that that the genius, of course, is a representative of a period, of a phenomenon like the Renaissance, not just a product. So that was a basic sort of understanding. And then we thought that, the genius, as we said, as Marcello said, is also a byproduct of a certain kind of 19th century historiography, German, male, elitist, white, of course. And I'm thinking something slightly different, thinking of the concept of how the Renaissance is conceived of today. And unfortunately or fortunately, the Renaissance is conceived of today in the halls and bedrooms of the RSA hotels, which is pretty much where this happens, with the Renaissance Society of America happens. And I was thinking, what emerges, from this new idea of the Renaissance. And this brings me back to one of my favorite sort of art historians that is practically forgotten, which is Eugenio Battisti. Eugenio Battisti wrote a book called The Anti-Renaissance, right? And the Anti-Renaissance is the sort of the idea that the Renaissance is not made up of geniuses, is not made up of of Michelangelo, Leonardo, and of Raphael, but it's made up of the grotesque, the monstrous, the demonic, the erotic currents, the medieval folklore. It's the ancestral traditions, the stimuli which are sort of ignited especially in 16th century art by, I don't know, superstition and folk mythology. I'm thinking of reports of troglodytes and monsters. I mean, it's a different kind of Renaissance. And what I'm noticing today is that that whether the people at the RSA have read Battisti or not, probably not, because it's a very convoluted book. It's one of the most convoluted books ever written, right? It makes me think that now it's the concept of the Renaissance is changing completely. In fact, it's not even called Renaissance anymore, right? And we're thinking more of something much more protean, more, the word is magmatic, and magmatico in Italian. It's something we cannot put our fingers on, and it doesn't really have a shape. So, I'm noticing that, that the genius, as we think about it, the Burkhardian genius, doesn't really exist anymore in sort of, in contemporary scholarship. I mean, we would try to avoid that. It's almost like something which we're scared of, And in fact, I'm thinking about, that more and more, the new genius is the anti-genius, is the Piero di Cosimo, is the Ontormo, are figures like that, and no longer the canonical ones that we've seen. And I think, and this is, again, I personally came across this by reading Eugenio Battisti, in a book that was written in 1962, written much later, of course, But also, I mean, it makes me think of, that we're almost afraid of the genius from a Renaissance point of view. And yet the word genius in contemporary society happens all the time. The prodigy, the talented kid, the great, Cristiano Ronaldo is a genius, and of course Elon Musk. So I'm thinking there's a dichotomy right here. But in our field, and that's the interesting thing, we are just beginning to see that what we thought that the Renaissance was, and the product of the Renaissance being the genius, is no longer what it was, or what it's crumbling, and that's why you have a lot of lesser known anti-geniuses, emerging, and they're the new geniuses in many ways. And this is what I've detected just simply by listening at panels at the Chicago RSA, this March. Since you're an expert on Pontormo, Elizabeth.
Well, before Elizabeth hits us with her Pontormo, which of course she'd love to do, and I would love to hear it. But I wanted to pick
up. I want to avoid talking about Machiavelli and Vasari because it always gets there, And it's just
exactly. No, I agree. Although I have to refrain myself, of course. But there is a more general point that Ada brought up, which I think sort of ties in this whole discussion and brings this idea of this art of negozio that is again about tying the past, the present, and the future, is what she just said, that even the most outlandish science fiction writers are unconscious historians, and this doesn't mean that they are doing the job that Alessio, Elizabeth, and the people around this table do, which is going into archive and digging out some potential truths about things that happened. They simply invent. So we go back also to the question that John was bringing up at the beginning. Is genius really invention, or is it, in the Platonic sense, simply the recreation, the reproposition of what is already existing as ever existed, and is simply combined in new fashions, in new sort of brilliant original forms? So what the many science fiction writers, of course, we can see it. I mean, the latest sagas like Dune that sound very much like commentaries on contemporary politics, more or less openly, for instance. It's very much an exercise in kind of wielding the past and turning it into a sort of a nightmarish apocalyptic future. So but it's done, I think, at a higher level, very deliberately and not unconsciously. I mean, the Denis Villeneuve certainly had in mind certain events that are very current and contemporary, and somehow also anticipated the most horrendous of them. So this exercise, and I wholeheartedly agree with Ada, of course, is something that really pushes us to see that, again, the individual creator of a world, be that a science fiction or a sort of historical fiction world, are nothing but a byproduct of a deep-rooted understanding of the human nature through history. And that's why it also becomes a sort of a catch-22. So that's why thinking about these issues, I think, is very relevant also to contemporary, AI and all that. This is something that is always in the back of our minds now. So I'd like to relance that kind of discussion, and then thank you, all of you, for what you said so far.
And if I could briefly add to that, as somebody who is both a scholar and a writer, so I hang out with scholars, but I also hang out with writers, it's enormously palpable how much damage is done by the paywall barriers and difficulty of accessing academic material. In one sense, the current Renaissance is being constructed in those rooms at RSA, but the Renaissance being constructed in those rooms in RSA will not reach the writers to have access to it for another 30 or 40 years, when the books that get written based on those things then end up being remaindered and then bought cheap and put into public libraries, because most of the books produced at RSA only end up in academic libraries. And because I am a scholar and attached to a university library, I would say several times a month a different novelist writes to me saying, hey, I've discovered the existence of this historian or this article who works on the thing I'm trying to find out about. Do you have access to it? Can you send it to me? Because they can. And writers do tons of research. They research for years, but the research that they do is in the stuff you can get when you're not a scholar, which means it's the stuff that's out of copyright, and it's the stuff that's from 1920, and it's the stuff that's in sort of watered down textbooks and in the simpler versions that public libraries have. And so I'm often talking to novelists who have put enormous amounts of sincere research into a topic and yet still don't have access to anything effectively written about it within the last 20 years, because all of that is still not just behind academic payrolls, but behind the academic networking, where how you even find out which scholar or which scholarly team is working on the subject that you work on, or what journal to search or what keywords to know, is really inaccessible for the people whose work is being read by 100 times as many people as ours, right? My science fiction novels, which also discuss the Renaissance, have been read by 1,000 times as many people as have read my academic book. And the history in them is good because I have access to the stuff that university libraries give me. But when I sit down in a room with other writers who are trying to be good historians, it's a big struggle for them to get a hold of any recent work, because the recent work is so often in somebody's academia.edu profile and in the collected papers from X conference, which even a very diligent writer, unless they've been trained in how to do searches through academic archives, doesn't know how to find where these publications are. They don't come up when you just search a regular public library access thing. They don't come up when you Google. And so thinking about projects like open access, how we can shorten how much time it takes for the Renaissance we construct in the hotel rooms at RSA to be accessible to the writers who are going to then spread it to 1,000 times as many people, is a very important question.
Yeah, no one really reads those articles, Ada. Not even the scholars. So, I mean, and I'm thinking of Umberto Eco, who was a great scholar and a great writer at the same time. I mean, and that's the kind of example that, that I think of, but I listen,
give a nice example. The writers do, like at
no,
this
no,
year's
I
RSA in Chicago, I took a novelist friend to RSA, who Joe Walton, who has written two novels about. She has a novel about Savonarola. She has a novel about Ficino, and I took her to RSA, and I kept introducing her to, look, it's Margaret Meserve, and she would say, Margaret Meserve, your book is so brilliant, and then rattle off the most detailed, comprehensive, encyclopedic knowledge of Margaret Meserve's book. So that Margaret Meserve was sort of standing there stunned that anybody had read her book that thoroughly. The writers read this stuff inside out, and you have never seen annotations on a printout of an article like the annotations a novelist puts on. Like, they really work at it. It's just that they can't find it unless there's someone there to guide them to it, which is a neat detail of the difference of perception.
As someone who constructed a digital platform that has over 30,000 original documents, I can tell you that there are a lot of writers. I'm the only one who actually can see the people because I'm sort of the PI. There are a lot of writers and very famous ones, very, very, very famous ones who access this kind of stuff. And I understand very well the desire, the need to do this. But and what I was bringing up before was something slightly different. It's like it is that the actual discipline of the Renaissance is changing. I mean, and the way we think about it, and therefore the concept of the genius is a little outdated, at least in our field. I never hear about, we still, I mean, Italy is famous for il genio di Michelangelo, il genio di Raffaello, il genio di Cicolante da Sermoneta, il genio da, Francesco da Formello, who artist that we never heard of, and it's very, very common to hear that because it's almost, it's an abuse in many ways, and that's what I was thinking. And I think we're lucky that the Renaissance is not just that, but it's a multitude of different kind of stimuli, right? Where someone like Pilliod or someone like Pontormo is a kind of a genius in many ways, and it is a kind, if you see it through the lens of the anti-Burkhardian sort of perspective, and that's what makes it very interesting, and when I was hoping, to sort of have maybe John talk about at the beginning the idea of the prodigy versus the one who takes a long time. Leonardo took a long time to become a genius. I mean, it was 28. He was still in the workshop of Verrocchio. I mean, it's sort of, if that is what a genius is. And I still hear, especially scientists, oh, but he was such a genius. He invented the helicopter. He invented these things. I mean, he had no idea of aerodynamics whatsoever. I mean, he had no concept of aerodynamics. So he did something that looks like a helicopter. And there's a genius. And that's what we were troubled about with Marcello, when we just heard, over and over this sort of this abuse of the word is coming from a concept, coming from a sort of a matrix that was invented again by someone like Burckhardt, and we're suffering that even today. And trust me, I'm not one of those people who thinks that the Renaissance is everything, like the Renaissance is, for me, is one, Italian, and 15th century. The rest is just footnotes. But I mean, but it is interesting to see how this is changing, is evolving, precisely because of of the different material you have available in an archive. The archive opens up, if you look at the archive of the Medici, of the 16th century Medici, 17th century Medici, of the Grand Dukes, you have material that is so variegated, and it's so outlandish. It's much more global than it is local. Number one, there's much more about the world than there is about and all of a sudden that epicentricity of genius, it's now confronted with the tsunami of data coming from all over the world, and a tsunami of novelties, and it's in a sense destroyed, and it's picked up again in the 19th century when it's reinvented, when it's refashioned for us to digest, because as Marcello and I were talking about before the meeting, we need a genius. We need it, and that's why we have AI, because we need AI. We need a genius. We need someone who does. We need the Deus ex machina so badly, because maybe we cannot live without the genius. I mean, or a kind of genius figure. And I'm talking about the contemporary geniuses today, not about the 15th, 16th century painters we've discussed.
Okay. Does any of the panelists want to add anything to our so far quite lively conversation?
I don't know. I just would say, you mentioned Pontormo, and obviously I've devoted a fair part of my life to that, and Bronzino and Alessandro Lori. So, which is the whole 16th century, and they're frankly, all three of them are completely misunderstood. It just depends on what you want me to focus on. But for Pontormo, in essence, as I've already said multiple times, the way he's presented by Vasari is quite damning. Then we have the unfortunate loss of everything he painted at Castello, Careggi and Castello, two Medici villas. The frescoes at the Certosa are in horrendous condition. For instance, the Capponi Chapel, the cupola was sliced off and is just whitewashed. So all the paintings that were in there are gone, and those paintings interacted with what is arguably his most famous painting, the entombment for the Capponi Chapel, right? Which was, has been on innumerable covers, to say the least, of books. But now it's seen as an unicum, as just one thing on a wall, which is white plastered around it. Then there's some fragments around the window, but the entire the global entirety of the chapel is destroyed because the ceiling is gone. The location of the 4 evangelists, which now appear to be wooden panels set into golden gilded oval frames. We're not even sure that we have them on the wall in the right order, let alone do we know what really surrounded them. Okay, so I'm being quite descriptive about this. Then, as I said, almost everything he did in the 30s is gone. And then the biggest commission of his life is gone. The San Lorenzo frescoes, to which I've devoted my most recent book, Pantormo at San Lorenzo. And I just say something so obvious that a child could say it. When there is no information, into a vacuum, a great many hypotheses will be interjected. And those hypotheses reflect the times and the places in which they arise. And that's why he is what considered a failure and an embarrassment in the 1920s, for instance. And in the 1960s, he's the darling of the people who wanted to see mannerism as the attack against high Renaissance classicism. They wanted to see it as a word that came up earlier, as sexy, as personal, as emotional, as psychological. Some of that has to be completely false because of what I said previously. I won't embarrass myself by repeating. And now, who knows? I mean, I have tried to right the ship a little bit by providing information that was not taken into account previously or which was undervalued, period, paragraph. And I think that is part of the evolution of the history of ideas, as we have all been discussing throughout this roundtable, and which is going to continue to evolve. As a matter of fact, with new factors, the newer interest in the previously marginalized sectors, which once you start looking at them, you can pull them into the center if you go do it. So I would encourage everybody who's listening to this to keep an open mind about what the Renaissance will be considered in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. I knew this would come. And Ada, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to briefly, I love and I want to echo the importance of how much where the blank spaces are in our knowledge of a figure can make that figure more malleable to what the future wants to make that figure into, and sometimes even enhance the fame of a figure. So I've been looking recently at the differences between the way 20th and 21st century scholars write about Alessandra Scala versus other female scholars in the period, like Cassandra Fedele. And Alessandra Scala is perfect because we lost all of her work. So we can imagine how great it probably was. And we have very few records of her doing things. So we can imagine her just doing the things we really want. And then she died fairly young. So we don't have to have the long depressing ending like how Cassandra Fedele spends decades in poverty because nobody wants to employ seriously a female humanista the way they would a male humanista, so that her biography is inevitably depressing. And also we have portraits of her where she has weird hair that is unappealing to a modern audience. But with Alessandra Scala, we have only, Poliziano's verbal description of how beautiful she is. And then we have, fragments referring to how great her work was. And then we have a nice short romantic life in which she can then die still young and beautiful. We can project anything we want onto her and make her into the ideal Renaissance woman without having any of the grim reality foist itself upon it, which has greatly magnified how much celebration there is of her, despite there being very little evidence of very much significant work. Just as another example of how sometimes blank spaces and having less of something enables the future to make it more into what we want. And when I saw in the description of this panel that the question of women in the context of genius was an issue, my mind immediately went to Alessandra Scala, who's the person I've seen most suggested as the female scholar to match Poliziano and Pico and Ficino, because her corpus is completely imaginary, so it can be anything we want. And that's very, very difficult problem for us to wrestle with as historians in our tendencies as well.
Well, I was going to suggest, of course, a bit provocatively, that perhaps we could experience sort of AI tasking, it to recreate those lost works by Pontormo, by Alessandra Scala, by many other geniuses or unknown, unrecognized, or forgotten geniuses. And this, of course, could lead us very far. But I'd like to see if John wants to say anything more.
Well, I might reply to what Alessio said. And he was talking, and also Elizabeth, about Pontormo and people who seem to be anti-geniuses. They are definitely not fitting into the conventional fold. The fact that such characters exist and they can operate is a form of proof that the age that they're in is a Renaissance, because the best definition of what determines a Renaissance is obviously not that they start imitating columns and classical art or something. Every century has had a Renaissance. They're getting shorter and shorter. In the 20th century, the Renaissance we had was called the 60s. And what determines a Renaissance is not the objects or anything. It's determined by something that's apparent to everyone, but it's known as articulated it. And it's called, it's a time that permits freedom of individual inquiry. And when you're leaving it, as we left it in the 80s, and you see if you were an adult as a teenager in the 60s and 70s, as a young adult, you got to really see what it was like in a time of freedom of individual inquiry. When you bumped into your friend, after the summer, right after college, you'd say, well, what'd you do this summer? And they would say everything from, I went to this thing, it was an outdoor concert at a place called Woodstock, New York. And another one says, I went to Mexico and experimented with all the kinds of hallucinations you can get from mushrooms. And when people said things like that, do you know what we said? Oh, that's interesting. When the 80s arrived and people said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, we're still in this, but everyone responds is, you know who would hate that? We immediately tell who in a position of some sort of authority, wouldn't like you doing that. I am telling you that for centuries, of the long Renaissance, the shorter Renaissance, we were given the freedoms to investigate that which we wanted. We're not in it now, and haven't been in it since early 80s. And that's another way of looking at the strange forms of a Pontormo and of the other people that Alessio mentioned. They're tolerated. Those people felt that they could do it, they could try it. They thought, you know what, it's already been done, everything by the painter without error, Sarto. And I'm going to try and be expressive. And nowadays, if you know artists, they feel they have less freedom to choose their subjects than for the past thousands of years. There's just a handful of subjects that our elite critics of art and so forth will consider important. My word, I mean, I'm happy to report that this year's still on Biennial of Venice is the first time in the last 25 years I've been going, for more than that, but at any rate, I can't remember. That's where to remember more than 25 years ago, everything was always about this overdone existentialism, you know, the damage that happened to the individual who just, you know, puts his heart out. Instead, this year, there was fascinating, completely independent of each other, where they're showing us scenes from history that, you know, like the civil rights marches and so forth, and other catastrophes or other forums where people came together and did things, they are totally forgotten. And the way the three different, Switzerland was one and Germany was another, they had the same metaphor. They showed time instruments and they showed water washing over them. So that is something I pass on for people to be aware of. There's a different way of identifying what constitutes a Renaissance.
Okay, so Alessio, I think that we should wrap this up. It's been very intense and it's getting a bit long at this point, but I wanted to remind all of the listeners and all of us that this is just the first of a few episodes. And next time we'd like to focus on science and genius, not that the Renaissance would consider the art separated from science, but that's exactly why we decided to do it artificially. And of course, technology being the sort of the daughter of science, but I think that all the things we said tonight are relevant to as a foundation to a more technocratic approach, which of course needs to be seen in a critical way, as many of the things that have been said tonight I think already anticipate. Alessio, I don't know if you want to say a few last words. I know you had also prepared a short clip from Benigni. I'm not sure you want to show it.
I'll show it some other time. I think it's most important. It's from a movie that he did with Jim Jarmusch, but it's something I'll show some other time. I agree. Yes, this is the first part. The second part will be on science, and it will probably happen in September. And I think that the summa of these discussions will be sort of, material for something a little more permanent, coming from us, from MAP and from the Art of Negozio and from Marcello, and of course from us as scholars here at MAP. And this is something which is outside our comfort zone, but we like always to work outside our comfort zone. This is exactly what we do, unlike the RSA. So that said, thank you very much. This was this was lots of fun, very enjoyable. And I think that we'll do more of this.
And thank you for organizing it. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you all.
Ciao, ciao, buonanotte.
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 Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.